Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Virtual Center is directed by Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien, and after missing a day yesterday, it is a pleasure to be back here with you at the Virtual Center on this Wednesday. Today is the 19th day of November. We are moving towards a week from tomorrow, of course, is Thanksgiving. And we are moving rapidly towards the end of the year. It's hard to believe. I received in the mail yesterday a brochure from the U.S. Postal Service about summer stamps and summer mailing and packages and all of those things, and it kind of hit me really hard how close this really is. And they had drop dead dates that you needed to mail packages by and all that other stuff. And it just dawned on me as to how quickly the year is ending, how quickly time flies, doesn't it, though? It is a pleasure to be with you today. I want to thank you for your confidence in us and your willingness to join us once again for the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I do not, as I've mentioned many times, and I don't want to overdo this, but I genuinely mean it. I don't take your loyalty and your support lightly at all. I think that there is time is one of the most valuable commodities that we have today. Most of us, very few of us, have enough of it, it seems like. And so therefore we must become more and more selfish, if you will, with our time. And when you are willing to devote an hour or 2 hours, a couple of days a week, 2 or 3 days a week to the Virtual Center, it basically creates, from my perspective, a responsibility that I do not take lightly. I respect it, I thank you, and I will continue to do everything I can do to make the time that you do spend with us valuable for you, time that hopefully is well spent, and hopefully information and ideas and perspectives that you might carry into other areas and share hopefully with other people. We have a phone number. We would love to hear from you, your ideas, your concerns or considerations, thoughts, perspectives on the issues of the day, which we'll touch on in a moment in terms of what I see today's program being about. Our area code is area code 304, and the number is 663-4676. That's 363 HORN, HORN. And again, area code 304. My email address, if you'd like to communicate.
Bill, 663.
Yes, what did I say? Didn't I say 663?
No, you said 363.
I did?
Yeah.
I apologize.
No worries. Just wanted to make sure people knew.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. I'm glad you're there,
yeah.
and you're right on the mark. Thank you.
I live to serve.
I'm looking at the phone number. Literally, I've written it down, and I'm looking at it, and I misspoke it. So the number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 663 HORN, HORN, area code 304. And I apologize for that, and thank you, Bob, very, very much. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. And some of the listeners have sent me some incredibly valuable links, suggestions on places to go and articles to read and issues to consider and all of that. I cherish that kind of communication. And if you would like to communicate with me via email, my email address is waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's W-A O'Brien, B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. My dad used to say all the time when we were growing up, emphasize that I-E-N because people are inclined to spell it I-A-N. And if you remember in the old Bat Masterson series on television, the lead was played by Hugh O'Brien, B-R-I-A-N. And my dad always used to say, the E-N is from the real Ireland. The A-N's are from Northern Ireland, and they're not really real. So anyway, it is, in this case, it is W-A O'Brien, I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. What I would like to do today, first of all, I'd like to return briefly, just briefly, to the program that we did day before yesterday on Monday on Jefferson's letter to Maria Cosway, the dialogue between the head and the heart that we pretty well completed on Monday. There was one, the sign-off, if you will, was the only portion of the letter that we didn't get to, and I wanted to open today's program by sharing that with you, and then reviewing very, very quickly some of the highlights and ingredients of that particular letter, but more important, offering some thoughts that I've had on why I think that particular letter is so significant and so important, so meaningful in so many different ways. And so that's really what I have in mind for today's program. Now that I opened my big mouth, I'll bet you that I can't lay my hands on that Jefferson document. And of course I didn't. It's elsewhere, but that's okay. I can remember it pretty well because it's one of those things that is really embedded, if you will. And when we break at the top of the hour, I will hopefully try to retrieve the original document and share the conclusion with you. But at this point then, let me just touch on it again and suggest to you why I think that particular document is so very significant. You'll recall that this was a letter that Jefferson wrote in October of 1786. He wrote it to Maria Cosway, who along with her husband has spent a number of weeks in Paris in the summer and late summer of 86. And of course, Jefferson had spent clearly as much time as he could get away with them. He obviously became very fond of Mr. Cosway, but clearly was smitten with Maria. There's absolutely no question that if there's any indication at all in the way people express themselves, that there's genuine affection and genuine love in the neighborhood, if you will, there's no question that Jefferson fell in love with Maria Cosway. And the depth and the sincerity and the sentiments associated with this in this letter are just clear evidence, to me at least, as to his incredible feelings of respect for Maria Cosway. And again, unlike the Sally Hemings situation, there is no evidence, we have no evidence that anything ever happened or came of this particular relationship with Jefferson beyond the summer of 1786. But you will recall that in this letter, Jefferson lays out a dialogue, if you will, between his head and his heart. And of course, his head is telling him that is telling his heart that it's constantly getting them into trouble. That Jefferson is too inclined to lead with his right, so to speak. He is not in the habit of looking before he leaps, as it were, and consequently, he creates situations which can only lead, according to the head, can only lead to grief and pain. By throwing himself so totally into the relationship that he developed with the Cosways during the summer of 1786, his head said, all he really did was set him up for the pain that was sure to come when the Cosways left. And indeed, that's what happened, and that's what prompts Jefferson to write this letter. On the other hand, Jefferson's heart responds to the head with a very, what I think, very pointed and very meaningful criticism of the way that the head looks at the world and its assumptions, the assumptions that all meaningful decisions in life are the product of careful calculation. The fact that one must be very, very careful about too many and too deep friendships being made because they lead to nothing but pain. And of course what Jefferson's argument is that what really makes the world go, what makes the world bright, what explains the fact that there is sunshine in the world is the fact that we can turn to each other and we can secure the kinds of warm, close, genuine relationships with other people that make life worth living. And of course Jefferson's heart concludes with the point that when one experiences relationships or friendships like that, the pain that one suffers when those relationships end for whatever reason is well worth because the benefits far outweigh the negatives. And that, that in a sense, and of course what we did on Monday was relate this to Ferdinand Tönnies' sociological theory of Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. What really endears me to this particular letter, there are several issues or several things that I would point to. The first one is I think it gives us insight into the soul, literally, of Thomas Jefferson like no letter I've ever read. I think after we read this, I feel that I know better what makes Thomas Jefferson tick. I have to say that I recognize that there are cautions, there are flags associated with the legacy and the reputation of Thomas Jefferson. The one that really means the most, obviously, is the issue of slavery, and we've addressed some of that. But the fact of the matter is the idea of putting the emphasis on sentiments rather than reason, the idea that in this dialogue between his head and his heart, it's clear that Jefferson places much more stock, much more weight in the sentiments coming from the heart than from the head. I think this is very significant. I think it tells us a lot about Jefferson. And let me be a little bit specific when I say that. This letter was written in 1786. 10 years earlier, Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence. And we have spent here at the Virtual Center I think an incredible amount of time with Jefferson's Declaration. And most recently, we looked at the Declaration of Independence from the perspective of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment. Specifically, we looked at the book Inventing America by Gary Wills. And we looked at an approach and an interpretation of the Declaration of Independence, which is one that we rarely hear about, at least almost never in our education system. There almost seems to be an official interpretation of the Declaration of Independence. And that's the one that is taught, and that's the one that students are expected to buy into and to master. And it is specifically related to the idea that when Jefferson talks about self-evident truths, he's talking about man's reason, the link back to the idea of the Declaration of Independence being directly derived from the writings and the philosophy of John Locke. And consequently, then, the self-evident truths that Jefferson addresses in the Declaration of Independence would be the idea that man's reason would lead him to conclude certain truths, and that that's what made them self-evident. And one of the things we saw in the Scottish Enlightenment, as we looked at the ideas of David Hume and Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson and some of the other writers of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment, was an alternative to the traditional interpretation of Jefferson's self-evident truths. Namely, that when you say that certain things are self-evident, you mean that they are generally accepted by the community at large. In other words, rather than focusing on man's individual reason and common sense, what would constitute truths that are self-evident would be truths that are generally accepted by the vast majority of the people in a particular community. In a sense, then, there is an alternative to interpreting Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Namely, rather than the Lockean idea of focusing on each individual's ability to reason and logically conclude what constitutes self-evident truths, it is possible that Jefferson was thinking more about the generally accepted notions of self-evident truths that were existent in the society or the community at large. That self-evident truths, then, would be determined more by looking at what the community believed rather than looking at what each individual's ability to reason caused him to conclude. We also looked at Jefferson's idea of what are those self-evident truths. That all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The traditional, official, generally accepted interpretation of Jefferson's Declaration is that equality most likely means equality of opportunity, an equal chance to pursue opportunity, self-interest. And that among the truths which would be life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the unalienable rights, if you will, the general conclusion was that the insertion of the pursuit of happiness in place of property, John Locke's second treatise on government mentioned life, liberty, and property, and the assumption that Jefferson is deriving the Declaration directly from Locke would cause one to question the insertion of pursuit of happiness in place of property. And the general answer to that, or explanation for that, is that Jefferson politically could not use the word property because that would suggest that the war for independence was really fought in order to protect the property of the wealthy, and that the pursuit of happiness was a kind of amorphous, meaningless term that everybody could subscribe to and get behind and support. Well, we looked at the Scottish philosophers and we began to recognize several other possibilities in terms of Jefferson's declaration. Among them, the fact that the mention of equality at the very beginning of the Declaration, that all men are created equal, is inserted in the Declaration of Independence before the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. And the question, of course, is this merely rhetorical? Or is there meaning to the fact that Jefferson inserts equality as kind of the first goal or the first objective, if you will, of this new nation? Well, what we learned from the Scottish philosophers, thanks to the scholarship of Gary Wills, is that the Scottish philosophers believed very firmly that equality meant just that. And that what they believed equality was all about was the idea, the existence of what they called the moral sentiment. Man's innate inclination to be moral and ethical. And man's innate concern for his fellow man. And that whereas the alternative interpretation of the Declaration would put the emphasis on the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of property, this particular interpretation of the Declaration would put the emphasis on man's ability to contribute, to give back to the community at large. And of course, what we saw in Gary Wills is the fact that Jefferson was educated and was quite taken, excuse me, with this idea of man's moral sentiment, man's inclination, man's being born with a conscience, and that this was really an important part of what humanity was all about, according to Jefferson and the Scottish philosophers that he read. And then we also looked at the 18th century definition of happiness. And what we found, looking again at the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, was that the idea of happiness in the 18th century, in this time, was most often associated with man's ability to make other people happy. Man's ability to reach a level of success which enabled him to take care of those who were not doing as well as he. And the question, of course, that Gary Wills raises is, in fact, maybe that's what Jefferson meant by the pursuit of happiness. Maybe Jefferson's entire intent philosophically in the Declaration of Independence was to lay out for the world the sentiments of the goals behind independence that suggested the creation of a society or of a nation, an independent nation, that really would make a sincere effort, a sincere commitment to the celebration of the ideals and the vision of this much more optimistic, much more positive, much more, quote, liberal idea that was being argued so well and so persuasively by Scottish philosophers, by the David Humes and Adam Fergusons and Adam Smiths and the others. Back to the point at hand. This letter to Maria Cosway that Jefferson wrote in 1787 seems to give us insight into a Thomas Jefferson who is much more favorable to the perspectives coming from his heart than he is those coming from his head. I would suggest that while Gary Wills in his book Inventing America does mention the Maria Cosway letter, the fact of the matter is the Jefferson that is revealed in this letter is the kind of Jefferson who would put down his ideas and his philosophy in the Declaration of Independence in ways which suggest that the Scottish Enlightenment approach to the Declaration might in fact be the right one. As I read that letter on Monday, the letter that we focused on Monday to Maria Cosway, what struck me is that a person who can write sentiments like these is a person for whom the idea of sentimentality and feeling is paramount. The very existence of that letter would incline me to lean much more toward the Gary Wills interpretation of the Declaration of Independence than the Lockean interpretation that is generally accepted. I find in that dialogue between Jefferson's head and his heart, I find real depth and understanding about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft in that letter. The sentiments and the feelings and the attitudes which define community, as opposed to those which explain society in Ferdinand Tunney's sociological study, I would suggest to you, are clearly reflected in the dialogue between Jefferson's head and his heart. There's absolutely no question that in the comments and the attitude towards life associated with the head in that dialogue, one sees a world associated with Gesellschaft. And in the sentiments that come from Jefferson's heart, one sees the kinds of priorities that would be most associated with the idea of Gemeinschaft rather than Gesellschaft. In that same letter, I see historical value in an effort to hopefully bring to students' attention and hope that students can begin to understand and appreciate the differences between what historians call a traditional society and a more modern one, a modernizing one. It would seem to me that the kind of world that we associate with modernization, with urbanization, with industrialism, with capitalism, with self-interest, with competitiveness, all the things that are associated in our mind with modernism, I would see in that letter in the comments coming from Jefferson's head. And I would see the criticisms of that coming from the heart being Jefferson's effort to celebrate the values associated with a much more traditional, much more humanely focused way of life. So I see value in the letter there. For scholars, I see a value in that letter of the difference between the French Enlightenment and the so-called Scottish Enlightenment. The difference between Enlightenment thinking grounded in reason, logic, and common sense versus an Enlightenment putting the premium on sentiment, on the moral sense, on sentiment, on man's concern for his fellow man, man's concern for his neighbor, man's willingness and ability to put the public interest ahead of his own self-interest. To be very honest with you, I see much in the comments of Jefferson's head in Madison's Federalist No. 10. In a frame of government, i.e. the Constitution of the United States, which at least in principle is based on the idea of self-interest, factions. Madison says in Federalist No. 10 that factions are sown into the nature of man. Factions are self-interest, are groups of people who organize for their own self-interest. In a society which puts a premium, in a constitution which puts a premium on individual freedom and the pursuit of self-interest, what Madison has created in the Constitution of the United States is not just a frame of government designed to manage and to address the realities of a competitive society, but in fact a frame of government which is based on the fact that those competitive relationships within society actually exist. In other words, Madison's Constitution of the United States, as expressed in Federalist No. 10 and Federalist No. 51, and the internal system of checks and balances, the idea of confronting or countering ambition with ambition, all of those things to me suggest modernization, suggest the kind of world that Jefferson's head is advocating in the Maria Cosway letter. I would suggest that anti-federalist reliance on Montesquieu's traditional idea of republican government, of republicanism, would seem to rely on the idea of civic virtue, would seem dependent, in order for republican government to work, man had to be willing to put aside his own self-interest in deference to the public interest. Or to put it the other way, man had to be willing to put the public interest ahead of his own self-interest. That was the ideal of republican government. That was the ideal that the Anti-Federalists was so desperately trying to defend and protect in the face of the Constitution that came out of the Philadelphia Convention. And again, I would suggest that what Madison has done in designing a system to deal with the reality of faction, he has in effect created a system that must have factions in order to function. What is the significance of that? The significance of that would be that whereas most people would argue that what makes the Constitution so brilliant is that Madison was able to put together a political system that addressed man as he really is. In other words, Madison is assuming that he knows what human nature is. It is self-interested, it is faction. And in fact, in Federalist number 51, Madison says, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government at all. And he says elsewhere in Federalist number 51 that government itself is the clearest statement we have of what man's nature really is. The fact that we have to construct a frame of government in order to regulate and threaten with punishment, in order to force people to do what they should do, is based on the assumption, but Madison would claim on the reality, that man's natural inclination is to pursue his own self-interest. And if we try to get him to do something else, we're going to have to force him to do it. I guess what I'm saying is the very debate over ratification of the Constitution of the United States is in part framed in the same context as this debate or dialogue between Jefferson's head and Jefferson's heart in the letter to Maria Cosway. It seems to me that this letter could become, in the hands of a gifted teacher, one of the most valuable learning experiences for students that one could imagine. It seems to me clear evidence of the value of primary sources and the ability to read critically and analytically and the ability to extract meaning from the primary sources. It seems to me that this letter and others like it promise an approach to education which would resolve a lot of the concerns and a lot of the worries that we seem to have in our society today about the deficiencies in our classrooms. I think this letter is incredibly important and incredibly valuable. And again, it causes me, I don't know, maybe I'm in the minority here, but it causes me to read that letter with a level of respect for Jefferson that I never had before. It's almost like Jefferson is on the couch and I am the psychiatrist. And we are having our session and he's talking and I'm listening and taking notes. What an experience. What a way to learn about a mind and a man, namely Thomas Jefferson. So that is essentially what I think that letter is about. And as I say, when we take our break at the top of the hour, I'll do my best to retrieve a copy of that letter, and then I'll share with you at the beginning of our second hour the final paragraph in which Jefferson signs off, because I think it, like the entire letter, the concluding paragraph is rich, or is the word that I used Monday, is delicious as well. I hope that you will agree. An area that has really caused me to think and wonder and read and for a long time has been the area of religion. I think, like most people, I'm a little bit skeptical sometimes of walking blindly into a discussion about religion because it is so dangerous. It's a minefield, if you will. But the issue that has really gotten my attention of late is the idea of what Jean-Jacques Rousseau called civil religion. In his social contract, written in 1762, Rousseau addressed in chapter 8 the idea of civil religion. There's no question that Rousseau's thinking in the area of religion is principally responsible for his book being banned throughout Catholic France in the 18th century. I think, very honestly, as I think back on my own educational experiences, it's almost as if Rousseau himself has been banned from our classrooms, even our university classrooms, because so many of his ideas seem to be so offensive to so many people. But the fact of the matter is, the idea of civil religion really attracted me. Because one of the things that I've seen throughout, in considering the history of this nation generally, is a contradiction which is so stark, so huge, that one can't help but trip over it time after time after time. And it's this one. How can you maintain a unified nation? How can you promote nationalism? How can you create on a national level the principles that we associate with the idea of community? How can you make a diverse nation, a nation made up of so many different peoples and nationalities and religions and ethnic groups? How can you govern it? And yet at the same time eliminate from the table, or eliminate from the equation, is the way I was going to say it, or remove from the table entirely the issue of religion? Because historically, it's religion that traditionally has promoted unity, has promoted community. It's the commonalities associated with worshiping a god or a series of gods that has created unity. So I guess the issue is, how do you, on the one hand, advocate the idea of separation of church and state, and on the other hand, try to create a community when you've taken away one of the key ingredients to the creation of that community, which is religion? The answer to that question was addressed in the 18th century by Rousseau. And so I've gone back and I reread Rousseau's, I've skimmed the social contract, but I particularly reread chapter 8 on the idea of civic religion, civil religion. And there's absolutely no question that in the course of doing research on this concept of civil religion, the name that continues to come up over and over again in our modern world is the sociologist Robert Bellah, B-E-L-L-A-H. In the 1950s, Robert Bellah based his sociological research and his sociological writing on Rousseau. Specifically, in 1967, Bellah published an article entitled Religion in America, in which he addressed Rousseau, and he addressed Rousseau's idea of civil religion, and he tried to resolve the conflict or the contradiction that I've already made reference to or referred to. A few years ago, let me be specific, I have a book in my hand here, and I'm looking for the publication date, if you bear with me. In 2006, 8 years ago, the journalist John Meacham, many of you probably have seen John Meacham on a number of panelists, as a panelist on a number of programs and political discussions or whatever. John Meacham, in 2006, published a book entitled American Gospel, subtitle, God, the Founding Fathers, and the Making of a Nation. If you haven't read this book, I encourage you to do so. I think it is a brilliant job. I thought so when I read it. I've read it 3 or 4 times. But in my research and in my interest in the idea of civil religion, I was drawn back to John Meacham's book, because John Meacham in his book uses the term public religion, and this is really what he means. So I took American Gospel off my bookshelves and I spent some time going through it, because I had marked it and underlined it extensively when I last read it. And I was mainly trying to get at the idea of what Meacham meant when he talked about public religion. And on page 16 of American Gospel, John Meacham addresses his thesis, what he is attempting to do in this book. I thought, as an introduction to the idea of civil religion, more specifically as an introduction to the writing of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I would share with you a little bit of John Meacham's approach to the study of religion in America, or as he calls it, God, the Founding Fathers, and the Making of a Nation. Meacham says religion is one of the most pervasive but least understood forces in American life. The point of this book is to explore the role that faith has played in the Republic, and to illustrate how the Founding Fathers left us with a tradition in which we could talk and think about God and politics without descending into discord and division. How can you talk about religion, talk about God, and not get into arguments with those whose God is not the same God you worship? That's Meacham's thesis. That's Meacham's mission. He said this book is not a full-scale history of religion in America or of the issue of separation of church and state. It is, rather, a narrative essay that covers much ground quickly and briefly, from the blood-soaked holy wars of the Old World to ecclesiastical imprisonments and executions in their own midst. The founders understood the dangers of mixing religious passions with the ambitions of politics. Their example can help us move forward in this, yet another age in which religion and politics provoke the most corrosive of debates. Why do so many feel the country is so divided at the moment? For the left, one factor is that it's been a very long time since the high watermark of post-World War II liberalism, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. For the right, the same era has been a time both of great strides and great setbacks. Conservative Christians are more influential today than in the past, but their power has come in reaction to what they view as threats to society, especially from the Supreme Court banning school prayer and permitting abortion. Both sides feel they're fighting for the survival of what is best about America. Liberals for openness and expanding rights, conservatives for a God-fearing, morally coherent culture. When such conflicts are cast in stark, often religious terms, they become ferocious. If totalitarianism was the great problem of the 20th century, extremism, at least so far, is the great problem of the 21st. And then he goes into a little bit about the issues of extremism. One of the issues that John Meacham addresses early on in his book is the argument of conservatives that America is a Christian nation. He says, the right's contention that we are a Christian nation that has fallen from pure origins and can achieve redemption by some kind of return to Christian values is based, Meacham says, more on wishful thinking than on convincing historical argument. Writing to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island in 1790, President George Washington assured his Jewish countrymen, quote, that America gives bigotry no sanction. In a treaty with the Muslim nation of Tripoli, initiated by Washington, completed by John Adams, ratified by the United States Senate in 1797, the founders declared the following, quote, the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, unquote. What Meacham then addresses is the idea of what he calls and what the founders called public religion. He specifically cites a wonderful quotation from Benjamin Franklin, which I'd like to share with you. In 1749, in a piece that discusses the proper education of the young, Franklin talked about the value of studying history as being at the heart of education, and this is what he said. Benjamin Franklin, morality, by descanting and making continual observations on the causes of the rise or fall of any man's character, fortune, power, etc., mentioned in history, will demonstrate the advantages of temperance, order, frugality, industry, perseverance. History will also afford frequent opportunities of showing the necessities of a public religion, from its usefulness to the public, the advantages of a religious character among private persons, the mischiefs of superstitions, and the excellence of the Christian religion above all others, ancient or modern. In 1790, when he was a very old man, March 9th, 1790, Franklin writes to the president of Yale University, Ezra Stiles. This was 14 years after the Declaration of Independence and just shortly before Benjamin Franklin was to die. And in that letter to Ezra Stiles, Franklin described his own faith. And this is what he says, quote, "I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence, that he ought to be worshipped, that the most acceptable service we can render to him is doing good to his other children, that the soul of man is immortal and will be treated with justice in another life, respecting its conduct in this. These I take to be the fundamental principles of all sound religion, and I regard them as you do in whatever sect I meet with them. As to Jesus of Nazareth, I think the system of morals and his religion as he left them to us the best the world ever saw or is ever likely to see. But I apprehend it has received various corrupting changes, and I have some doubts as to his divinity, though it is a question I do not dogmatize upon, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble." Franklin is saying that I have certain issues associated with some of the key ingredients of Christianity, but I'm not going to spend time worrying about it because, very honestly, I'm going to find out very quickly, very soon, which end is up and which end is down. Then John Meacham, and I know we're moving towards the top of our hour here, but let me hang in there with me for a few moments before we take our break. John Meacham then goes into what I think is the heart of his thesis. He says, properly understood, the God of public religion is not the God of Abraham or God the Father of the Holy Trinity. The Founding Fathers had ample opportunity to use Christian imagery and language in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but they did not. At the same time, they were not absolute secularists. They wanted God in American public life, but given the memory of religious warfare that could engulf and destroy whole governments, they saw the wisdom of distinguishing between public religion and private religion. In churches and in homes, anyone could believe and practice whatever he wished. In the public business of the nation, however, it was important to the founders to speak of God in a way that was unifying, not divisive. Nature's God was the path they chose, and it has served the nation admirably. Despite generations of subsequent efforts to amend the Constitution to include Jesus or to declare that America is a Christian nation, no president across 3 centuries has made an even remotely serious effort to do so. Public religion is not a substitute for private religion, nor is it a Trojan horse filled with evangelicals threatening the walls of secular America. Public religion is rather a habit of mind and of heart that enables Americans to be at once tolerant and reverent. 2 virtues of relevance to all. For the founders' public religion is consummately democratic. When a president says, God bless America, or when we sing, America, America, God shed his grace on thee, each American is free to define God in whatever way he chooses. A Christian's mind may summon God the Father, a Jew's Yahweh, a Muslim's Allah, and atheists no one or no thing. Such diversity is not a prescription for dissension. It is really part of the reality of creation. I think there's a lot there to think about. I trust that you will do that. I'd like to come back and revisit this, and more specifically, I'd like to get into Jean-Jacques Rousseau's approach to the idea of civil religion in our second hour today. But we have reached the top of our first hour. It's 1 minute after the hour, 1 minute after 2 in the Eastern Standard Time Zone. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Please stay with us. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back with our second hour. Please stay tuned. Stand. Well, thank you, and welcome to the second hour of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. On this, our Wednesday program, it is the 19th day of November. It is a pleasure to be with you. If you've been with us through our first hour, we did a fairly extensive review of the Maria Cosway letter from Thomas Jefferson in 1786, focusing most specifically, at least I try to, on why I think that particular letter is so valuable in so many ways. I had intended at the beginning of our program today, in our first hour, to share with you the final paragraph of the letter, the point at which Jefferson signed off, so to speak, in this letter, and I was unable to lay my hands on it. Well, I now have it, and so I think I'd like to begin this second hour by returning very quickly to that article. But again, the focus of our second hour is on the idea of civil religion, what John Meacham in his book American Gospel referred to as public religion. And he makes the point, and I think this is important, the distinction between private religion and public religion. The distinction, if you will, between a nation that frequently makes reference to and supports the idea of religion itself, the idea of God, the idea of a supreme being, and at the same time advocates separation of church and state. And that seems in the mind of many people to be a contradiction or a basis for political controversy and for challenge. I think that in order to go to the well, so to speak, or go to the source, one must return not to 2006 and John Meacham's book. One instead must go to the same source that John Meacham went to, which is Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his 1762 Social Contract, Chapter 8, in which Rousseau addresses the idea of civil religion. And that's what I'd like to deal with here in our second hour today. Let me share with you our phone number and invite you to participate actively in our program by giving us a call and sharing your thoughts with those others who are out there listening. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to communicate with me via email, I invite you to do that. My email address is waobrien, I-E-N, 906 @gmail.com. waobrien 906 @gmail.com. Before we get back to Rousseau, let me, if I can, share with you the conclusion of Jefferson's letter to Maria Cosway. He has the this very extensive sermon, if you will, from the heart, which is I believe the essence, the bulk of this letter, and it's very excellent. In this paragraph, extensive paragraph, Jefferson cites two examples of a situation where the head has dictated a response at the beginning, but then the heart took over at the end and realized a horrible mistake was made. You may remember we dealt with this on Monday. The first one was the idea of a wearied soldier that they came upon on the road who was looking for a ride. And the head determined that since the road was full of soldiers, if we allowed all of them to jump in the wagon, our horse would fail in the journey. Consequently, we won't pick up the first one. And as Jefferson's heart said, we drove on. But soon, becoming sensible, you had made me do wrong, that though we cannot relieve all the distressed, we should relieve as many as we can. I turned about to take up the soldier, but he had entered a bypath and was no more to be found. And from that moment to this, I could never find him out to ask for his forgiveness. That's the first example. The head's inclination.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob?
Sorry to interrupt, but just in what you touched on there, something immediately popped within my imagination. What is the date of the letter?
October 1786.
So somewhere between 1786. Okay, here's what I'm wondering. Was that recently discovered, or has it been known about for quite some time? That letter?
The letter?
Uh-huh.
Oh no, the letter it's been in the Jefferson papers for a long time.
Okay. Well, the reason I ask is,
but I don't think it's been read as carefully as it should have been.
Well, that one little passage there, just because of the English major that I am, made me think immediately of Robert Frost and The Road Not Taken, or The Road Not Traveled.
Ah, okay, I understand. I understand.
Because I think Jefferson, he and Jefferson are both touching the same sentiment.
Yes, exactly.
That there are choices we make which cannot be unmade.
Right. And what Jefferson is saying is we made the wrong one, and then by the time I realized that and came around to making the right one, it was too late.
And Frost says, and sad that I could not be two travelers, I chose the one. Right.
And see, and what the head tells Jefferson here is, since we can't take them all, let's not get ourselves into trouble by taking any. And then, of course, Jefferson's rationale, reasoning is that we need to do all we can. We can't do everything that's necessary, but all of us need to do as much as we can. I think it's just beautiful sentiment.
Well, it is, and I also wonder to the extent, the workings of the mind of a young man and the workings of the mind of an old man are often quite different creatures.
Uh-huh.
And I wonder how much how much of this is because this is a sort of middle-aged Jefferson, right?
Yeah. Yeah, in the 80s. Well, I'm not sure. He's probably in his 40s. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm guessing late 30s, 40s. But
and it's in that time period that we tend to look and say, well, if I'd done this differently, I would have been elsewhere. Whereas in youth we have all the world before us, and everything is a choice.
Yeah.
And
I see what you're saying.
And as our age progresses, we look back and say, well, these are the choices I made that they've brought me here. What have I learned?
Yeah.
But in that middle space, I think you get a greater degree of questioning, and it certainly seems like that's what's going on here.
Right. And I have tremendous respect. I think one of my reasons for getting into a letter like this is I have tremendous respect for somebody who's actually reflecting on these kinds of choices. I mean, this is a guy, to me, this is a guy that cares, and a guy that's constantly trying to figure out the right thing to do. And I don't think we can help but respect somebody who's going through that.
Well, and Frost writes of the two paths that he sees, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. Mm-hmm. And Jefferson's espousing that same sentiment. I tried to go back, but I couldn't.
I tried, but I couldn't. Because it's almost like what is the Eastern philosophical expression that you can't dip your toe into the same river twice.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the ancient Greek philosophers.
Right. And the whole idea that things are moving, things move on, and the situation that caused you to make a particular decision in one situation it has changed. And
Jefferson is manifesting remorse that he couldn't go back and make amends, and he wondered, right. And he says he wonders to that day,
right,
about the person that he offended,
right. And I guess, Bob, I have to consider this particular Jefferson when I think about in 1782 he wrote his notes on the state of Virginia. And that's where he goes into this detailed analysis, self-reflection in his mind about slavery and about blacks, and to what extent are they equal to or inferior to, and in what sense are they not? And he's wrestling with these kinds of things, and he's thinking, and I have a lot of respect for that. I mean, he doesn't do things idly without putting in the sweat equity, if you will, first,
Oh, I think this is the Jefferson with which we can most easily become both sympathetic and enamored.
Yes.
Because this is an individual who is trying to sort out, the larger questions of existence, not whether to have bacon or sausage for breakfast the next morning, but whether there should be a next morning.
That's right.
He is troubling himself with the essential problems of existence, and even with the relationship or whatever we will call it with Maria Cosway.
Yeah.
I think about the other remarks we have about Jefferson from other quarters that talk about how he was so shy and how he was so introverted.
And he was not a good speaker.
And when he spoke in a high and a reedy voice.
Yes.
And so he takes up his quill and his paper, and that may be the only way that, for all we know, they may have spent happy hours, he and the Cosways, in conversation, or, he had a love of wine, a love of things beautiful, a love of music, a love of learning and knowledge.
Yep.
But he may never have been able to give adequate expression to that. This may be the best, the closest thing that he ever got.
Yeah. That's a good thought, Bob. That's a good thought.
And when you ponder that, he becomes a very, very human individual.
That's my conclusion. And I think that if in our schools, and I'm not necessarily changing the subject here, but I really think in our schools, if we could allow students to experience this kind of stuff, instead of just saying Jefferson believed this, he wrote this, he said this, he said that, and what you do is you cherry pick so you quote the things that you would say yourself, and basically what you're doing is saying what I believe Jefferson believed, and here's the proof.
Well, you're conveying a Jefferson that you want the young scholar to perceive. But on the other hand, if you think about the scenario that I just laid out, any boy, or in modern terms girl, mm-hmm. who has ever picked up the phone to dial, there's that word, dial. Yeah. We don't dial, but to call say, someone upon whom he or she has a young perceived romantic interest and has gotten to the sixth digit and hung up out of terror, out of fear, out of what if I'm rejected.
Right.
Well, if you present this to kids that way, they're going to go, oh, he was a human. You mean he was a human being?
Being, yeah, exactly.
Like me?
That's the whole point. And he wasn't any more sure than I am about things. I think that our young people would develop a tremendous respect for these people and would want to emulate the process that they were going through, because look what they ended up doing. And so obviously what most young people would conclude is there must be something positive about going through this process, because we're talking about Thomas Jefferson or John Adams or George Washington. We're talking about pretty powerful people here.
And I could learn to do the same thing.
Same thing, exactly.
Because presenting any great historical figure as someone who simply received wisdom from on high and acted on it is a fraud being perpetrated upon the student.
It is. It is, and what it allows you to do is propagandize, but it doesn't provide students an opportunity to really learn and to reflect and to think and to see the value of wrestling with these kinds of important questions. You're right about that effort to call somebody that you really have an interest in, and you back off at the last minute, or being sitting along the wall at a dance, or at a record hop, or whatever, with a DJ or something, looking across the room and seeing somebody you'd love to dance with and not being able to screw up the courage to walk over there and ask because of the pain of rejection.
Right, because because in that situation, no has all the is freighted with all the trappings of being slapped in the face.
That's right. That's right. And I find this letter so positive in so many different ways. And plus just the choice of the language, the choice of words, and when you hear the conclusion of this, the way he signs off is just...
Well, I'll leave you to it, but I just had to throw that in there because
thank you. I appreciate
the connection to Frost just slapped me in the face.
Jump right out at you. Oh yeah. Well, anyway, thank you, Bob.
My pleasure, Bill. Thank you.
It's at this point that Jefferson says, I thought this a favorable proposition whereon to rest the issue of the dialogue. So I put an end to it by calling for my nightcap. Methinks I hear you wish to heaven I had called a little sooner, and so spared you the ennui of such a sermon. Jefferson is kind of apologizing for the length of this letter. And then he said, I did not interrupt them sooner because I was in a mood for hearing sermons. You too were the subject. And on such a thesis, I never think the theme long, not even if I am to write it, and that slowly and awkwardly as now with the left hand. Basically what he's saying to her is, it was about you, so it was not long, is what he's saying. I will promise you on my honor. Oh, he said, but that you may not be discouraged from a correspondence which begins so formidably, I will promise you on my honor that my future letters shall be of a reasonable length. I will even agree to express but half my esteem for you, for fear of cloying you with too full a dose. Isn't that beautiful? I will even agree to express but half my esteem for you, for fear of cloying you with too full a dose. But on your part, no curtailing. If your letters are as long as the Bible, they will appear short to me. Isn't that wonderful? If your letters to me are as long as the Bible, they will appear short to me. Only let them be brimful of affection. As to myself, my health is good, except my wrist, which mends slowly, and my mind, which mends not at all. Isn't that delicious? But broods constantly over your departure. The lateness of the season obliges me to decline my journey into the south of France. Present me in the most friendly terms to Mr. Cosway, and receive me into your own recollection with a partiality and a warm proportioned, not to my own poor merit, but to the sentiments of sincere affection and esteem with which I have the honor to be, my dear madam, your most obedient and humble servant. If I ever got a letter like that from anybody, boy, isn't that something? What a beautiful piece of writing. Anyway, Bob, thank you for your contribution, and I'm so glad that it means a lot to me that you appreciate the richness of this letter, because it kind of indicates that I'm on the right track. I have I have quite a bit of respect for the things that you appreciate as well, and I thank you for chiming in with us. I wanted to get back to the idea of public religion, as it were, and I thought that, first of all, a little bit about this particular issue on civil religion by Rousseau. Did I say Thoreau? By Rousseau, on chapter 8 of his Social Contract. And he lays out much of this is a history of the world, more specifically a history of the relationship between religion and power, and the powers of the state, if you will. And he says, at first, men had no kings save the gods, and no government save theocracy. Translation, of course, is that there was no separation between church and state. They were one and the same. They reasoned like Caligula, and at that period reasoned aright. It takes a long time for feeling to change so much that men can make up their minds to take their equals as masters, in the hope that they will profit by doing so. He points out that for much of the history of the world then, religion and political power were connected, were linked. From the mere fact that God was set over every political society, it followed that there were as many gods as peoples. I'm going to pause. I apologize for that delay. I had somebody ringing the doorbell, and I'm here by myself. So I felt like I thought it might have been an emergency. Actually, it kind of was. There's an issue on the street, and I apologize for the interruption. I thought I was hearing the doorbell, even with the earphones on, and that's why I took the pause. I'm trying to get my head back into the issues here. Let's go back to Rousseau. From the mere fact that God was set over every political society, it followed that there were as many gods as there were peoples. In other words, throughout much of history, each people had its own gods, had its own set of gods. Two peoples that were strangers the one to the other, and almost always enemies, could not long recognize the same master. Two armies giving battle could not obey the same leader. National divisions thus led to polytheism, and this in turn gave rise to theological and civil intolerance, which, as we shall see hereafter, are by nature the same. What Rousseau is basically claiming here is that throughout history each people had its own set of gods, and they were theocracies. Political power and religious power or influence were part of the same package, if you will. As he says, two peoples that were strangers to one another and almost always enemies could not recognize the same master. It would be naive, it would be counterproductive or contrary to common sense that two peoples that were totally different would worship the same God. The fancy that the Greeks had for rediscovering their gods among the barbarians arose from the way they had of regarding themselves as the natural sovereigns of such people. In other words, the Greeks, during the height of the power of Athens and Sparta, the Greeks usually considered themselves superior to the peoples they conquered. And they oftentimes, as he said, they had a knack, if you will, for rediscovering their gods among the peoples they conquered. But there is nothing, he said, so absurd as the erudition which in our days identifies and confuses gods of different nations, as if there could still be anything common to imaginary beings with different names, as if the Phoenician Baal, the Greek Zeus, and the Latin Jupiter could be the same. And of course what he's suggesting here is that history tells us that religion was a key part of the state's power, of political power, and it was not possible to separate the two. If this one I've marked as a key paragraph. If it is asked how in pagan times, where each state had its cult and its gods, there were no wars of religion. In that period of history, when each state had its own gods, its own set of gods, its own set of religious beliefs, its own cult, as it were, there were no wars of religion. And the reason for that, he said, I answer that it was precisely because each state, having its own cult as well as its own government, made no distinction between its gods and its laws. Political war was also theological war. The provinces of the gods were, so to speak, fixed by the boundaries of nations. In other words, there was a symmetry, a connectedness, a linkage, if you will, between religion and secular power that could not be separated and should not be separated. He says, the God of one people had no rights over another. The gods of the pagans were not jealous gods. They shared amongst themselves the empire of the world. Even Moses and the Hebrews sometimes lent themselves to this view by talking about or speaking of the God of Israel. So the assumption was that God was associated with a particular people, a particular state, a particular boundaries, if you will. But when the Jews, being subject to the kings of Babylon and subsequently to those of Syria, still obstinately refused to recognize any god but their own, their refusal was regarded as rebellion against their conqueror. The assumption was that if you were conquered by another power, part of the conquest was to buy into their gods, to accept their gods as yours. The Jews refused to do that. The Jews refused to accept the gods other than their own. And because they refused to do that, Rousseau says, this was viewed by the conquerors as rebellion against the conqueror, and led to the persecutions we read of in Jewish history. Every religion, therefore, being attached solely to the laws of the state which prescribed it, there was no way of converting a people except by enslaving it, and there could be no missionaries save conquerors. So the idea that we have today of religions, I'm thinking specifically of Christianity, but I would suggest to you that Islam is the same. The idea of evangelical religion committed to the idea of converting people. What Rousseau is saying is that at this point in history, the only way to convert people was to conquer them. There were no missionaries save conquerors. The obligation to change cults being the law to which the vanquished yielded, it was necessary to be victorious before suggesting such a change. So far from men fighting for the gods, as in Homer, fought for men. Each asked his god for victory and repaid him with new altars. Before taking a city, the Romans summoned its gods to quit it. The idea being that you weakened your potential enemy if you could successfully persuade its gods to abandon it. And so the message here is quite clear, and that is that the power of the state is enhanced by religion. And the fact that religion and state power, secular power, are linked so closely together is historical tradition. And throughout the history of the world, the Romans, the Greeks, all peoples appreciated this. And Rousseau points out, they left the vanquished their gods as they left them their laws, the Romans. Finally, when along with their empire, the Romans had spread their cult and their gods, and had themselves often adopted those of the vanquished, by granting to both alike the rights of the city, the peoples of that vast empire insensibly found themselves with multitudes of gods and cults, everywhere almost the same. Thus paganism throughout the known world finally came to be one and the same religion. And then we have the emergence of Christianity. It was in these circumstances, Rousseau says, that Jesus came to set up on earth a spiritual kingdom, which by separating the theological from the political system made the state no longer one and brought about the internal divisions which have never ceased to trouble Christian peoples. Rousseau's message here is that Christianity brought change to historical tradition in the traditional linkage or connection between secular power and religion. Because Christianity preached two separate kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. And the assumption is that you could do justice to both. As the new idea of a kingdom of the other world could never have occurred to pagans, they always looked on Christians as really rebels, who, while feigning to submit, were only waiting for the chance to make themselves independent and their masters, and to usurp by guile the authority they pretended in their weakness to respect. This was the cause of the persecutions. What Rousseau is doing here is criticizing what pagan peoples interpreted to be the guile of Christians, because Christians preached submission to the secular power at the same time that they could remain loyal to the heavenly power. That the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man were different. Certain things belong to God, certain things belong to Caesar, as it is said. What the pagans feared took place. Then everything changed its aspect. The humble Christians changed their language, and soon this so-called kingdom of the other world turned under a visible leader into the most violent of earthly despotisms. With the appearance of Jesus came the leader and the desire to convert. And suddenly the suspicions of the pagans were realized. That while Christians pretended that they could be loyal and submit to any secular power because it didn't interfere with their religious priorities in the other kingdom, in the heavenly kingdom. The fact of the matter is, when Christianity became evangelical and sought to convert the world, then the worst fears of the pagans were borne out. Several peoples, however, even in Europe and its neighborhood, have desired without success to preserve or restore the old system. And what Rousseau is talking about here is, in the face of Christianity, there have been various efforts to try to restore the old linkage, if you will, between secular and religious power. But, he says, the spirit of Christianity has everywhere prevailed. The sacred cult has always remained, or again become independent of the sovereign, and there has been no necessary link between it and the body of the state. Christianity, the kingdom of God and not of this world, has always claimed to remain above and aloof from, separate from, secular power. And then Rousseau addresses, I think this is particularly timely, the issue of Islam, Muhammad. He says Muhammad held very sane views and linked his political system well together. And as long as the form of his government continued under the caliphs who succeeded him, that government was indeed one, and so far, good. Initially, Islam, under Muhammad, was modeled on the old tradition of a linkage between religion and secular power. I think what we're seeing in the world today in the form of ISIS is an effort to restore that very same linkage. According to Rousseau, Muhammad originally created it, and as long as the caliphs who succeeded him continued it, the government stayed one. But the Arabs, having grown prosperous, lettered, civilized, slack, and cowardly, were conquered by barbarians. The division between the two powers began again. What Rousseau is referring to here is the split between the Sunnis and the Shias that emerged within Islam during this period. And although it is less apparent among the Mohammedans than among Christians, it nonetheless exists, especially in the sect of Ali, and there are states such as Persia where it is continually making itself felt. So what Rousseau is claiming here is that originally Muhammad and Islam were modeled on the traditional model of a linkage between secular and religious power, but that the Arabs, because they were conquered by barbarians, so to speak, ended up dividing the world of Islam. And of course, they've suffered under that division ever since. And then Rousseau goes to the kings of England and points out that the king of England is the head of the church, and the czars in Russia have done the same. But the fact of the matter is, that doesn't make kings masters of churches. More often than not, it makes them its ministers, Rousseau says. I personally find this next issue, and it's 15 minutes before the end of our program, so we'll kind of try to wind this down and bring it to a logical end. Rousseau has some very kind words for Thomas Hobbes. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the name of Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan, and Hobbes's defense for absolute government in England. You'll recall that Hobbes's Leviathan came out in defense of the absolute power of the king in the person of Charles I. Charles I was beheaded in 1649 in the Civil War, in the English Civil War. Hobbes's Leviathan was a defense of absolute power in government. In other words, what Hobbes was advocating was what was historically true. That in order to be successful, government's power had to be absolute. Thomas Hobbes has received rather negative treatment in our educational establishment because he is contrasted with John Locke. Whereas Thomas Hobbes argued for the absolute power of government, Locke wrote in defense of the Glorious Revolution, Parliament's successful efforts to limit the power of the king in England in 1688. And because of the attraction for Thomas Hobbes and the idea of limited government, I don't think the reputation of Thomas Hobbes has ever had its full airing in our American education system. Our affection for Locke and the idea of limited government has made Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan look like an ogre. But from Rousseau's perspective, Thomas Hobbes was really talking about what in fact history defended. He says, of all Christian writers, the philosopher Hobbes alone has seen the evil and how to remedy it, and has dared to propose the reunion of the two heads of the eagle, and the restoration throughout of political unity, without which no state, no government will ever be rightly constituted. But he should have seen that the masterful spirit of Christianity is incompatible with his system, and that the priestly interest would always be stronger than that of the state. It's not so much what is false and terrible in his political theory, Rousseau says, as what is just and true that has drawn down hatred upon it. What has turned people against Hobbes is what is true about Hobbes, says Rousseau. He is painted as an ogre because of his advocacy of absolute government, absolute power. But the fact of the matter is, Rousseau says that's what history confirms. Rousseau says, I believe that if the study of history were developed from this point of view, from the Hobbesian point of view, it would be easy to refute the contrary opinions of Bellah and Warburton, one of whom holds that religion can be of no use to the body politic, while the other, on the contrary, maintains that Christianity is its strongest support. And what Rousseau is saying, if we really understood what Hobbes was telling us about the necessary linkage between secular and religious power, we would be able to understand why neither of those positions is valid, namely that religion plays no role in secular power, or on the other side of the coin, that Christianity is the strongest support for political power. Both of those, Rousseau says, are mistaken. We should demonstrate to the former that no state has ever been founded without a religious basis, and to the latter, that the law of Christianity at bottom does more harm by weakening than good by strengthening the constitution of the state. What Rousseau is saying is that despite Christianity's advocacy of the idea of two separate kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man, and Paul's argument that it is possible to be loyal to both, that one must be loyal to the secular power, but one must also be loyal to the spiritual power, and that the two, because they are separate, are not necessarily contradictory. What Rousseau was saying is that is not true. Christianity, by definition, does more harm than it does good to the constitution of the state. And specifically, Rousseau talks about the religion of man and the religion of the citizen. and he distinguishes between the two. I'm trying to find a way to pull this together quickly. What I find interesting here, first of all, I find this extremely complex. This is extremely abstract and extremely deep for me. I trust it is for you as well, and I apologize for that. But I think at the same time, the principle that Rousseau is defending here is an important one. What he would be saying today is that what ISIS is trying to do is exactly what history tells us needs to be done. The only way that the state, that secular power, political power, can be exercised wisely is when religion is part of that state. And so the idea of ISIS, namely the idea of setting up an Islamic state based on the philosophy and the teachings of the Quran, in other words, doing the same thing with the Quran that John Winthrop tried to do in Puritan Massachusetts with Scripture. That's not outside the realm of historical tradition. That is historical tradition. And I think that's the point that Rousseau is making here. When Rousseau talks about the religion of man versus the religion of the citizen, he's talking about the belief system that is within every one of within man, irrespective of what the state laws are. He says the religion of man, which has neither temples nor altars nor rites, and is confined to the purely internal cult of the supreme God and the eternal obligations of morality, is the religion of the gospel pure and simple, the true theism, what may be called natural divine right or law. What Rousseau is talking about here in the form of what he calls the religion of man is the same kind of thing that Jefferson was referring to in the Maria Cosway letter, namely man's innate ability to know right from wrong, good from bad, just from unjust. And when he talks about the religion of man, he's talking about what every man knows to be true. He said it is confined to the purely internal cult of the supreme God and the eternal obligations of morality. It is the religion that drives all men, namely what man knows to be true and to be real. This, he says, is the religion of the gospel pure and simple. Not what the churches have done to the gospel, but what the gospel and its direct relationship to man is really all about. The other, which he calls the religion of the citizen, which is codified in a single country, gives it its gods, its own patrons. It has its dogmas, its rites, its external cult prescribed by law. In a sense, then, he's making a distinction between what man knows internally to be right and what the state claims ought to be right. That's the churches and the rites and the ceremonies and all the accoutrements, if you will, that go with religion. Let's call it there. It's 58 minutes after the hour. We've only got a couple of minutes left in today's program, and I want to thank you for tuning in to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. This is a heavy one. I knew it would be. The issue of religion and the degree to which religion is and ought to be connected to political power, and what states have done to try to revisit that traditional historical connection. Namely, we're looking at Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his idea of civil religion. This is our last program this week. We will be back together again the first of next week, next Monday. It is Thanksgiving week, as you know. In the meantime, I want to thank you for tuning into the Virtual Center. I encourage you to have a wonderful week. Weather the weather, as they say, and by all means be safe, because for sure we want you back with us here on the Horn and at the Virtual Center. For Bob Kincaid and the folks at the Head On Radio Network, this is Bill O'Brien saying thank you so much and be safe.